Yeah. 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 Yeah, there are different levels of bless your heart. Yeah. Yeah, and yeah, it's all in the inflection. And yeah, and the what syllable you emphasize. All right, well, let's get started. All right, so we're continuing in the the United Kingdom history of Israel. I haven't figured out a good way to say that makes sense. United Kingdom history of Israel, or you just say the United Kingdom of Israel. I don't know. Anyway, last week or last time I was teaching, we did an overview of what we're going to look at in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, and so today we're going to take a look at the life of Samuel and Hannah. But first, just to kind of recap, so in the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, we covered that a couple semesters ago. We saw Israel rescued out of slavery from Egypt, right? We saw that God made a covenant with them at Mount Sinai. They eventually made it to the Promised Land, all right? A couple little detours along the way, but God was faithful, and he to His promise, He led them to a land that was good, that was flowing with milk and honey. I mean, it was the land chosen for them. But they were to be faithful to God and obey His commands. All right? Were they faithful, and did they obey His commands? They did not, right? So we saw in Judges last semester we saw in Judges how the people failed miserably. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. God provided judges to turn the people back to Him, but by and large they failed. So the books of Samuel describes Israel's transition from tribes to a kingdom ruled by David. So we're going to look at the life of Samuel in 1 Samuel 1 through 7. We'll look at Saul's rise to power in 1 Samuel 8 to 15, Saul's downfall and death in 1 Samuel 16 to 31, David's rise to power in 1 Samuel 16 to 31, David's failure in 2 Samuel 10 through 20, and then we'll look at Solomon in 1 Chronicles and then also 1 Kings. Now, before we get started tonight, does anybody remember the 5 themes of the historical books? The five themes that we find in the historical books. All right. God's what? Okay, good. See, I have a hard time with that too. Sovereignty. And that's just going to, I think that's right. Is that right? I always remember that. I always try to, there's the word, oh wait, that's not right, is it?
Yeah, rain's right.
Okay, yeah, rain. There's the word rain is in there. All right. Yeah, I know, yeah, I know. All right, number 2, God's what? Good. Y'all looking back on notes, aren't you? That's right. Hey, that's okay. I think that's one of the reasons that professors give open book tests, right? So that there's value in sometimes looking back over your notes. All right, what? Promises. All right, we'll just do that. Okay, number 4, God's covenants. All right, and number 5, God's kingdom, right? All right, so as we go through the lesson tonight, and also, and through all the books that we're going to look at, I want us to keep these things in mind, all right? And I want us to learn to see where we see these 5 themes kind of come up in these books, and I think you'll see pretty quickly. Now remember, in the Hebrew Bible, 1 Samuel comes right after Judges, and when we left Judges, where did we find the people? Or what was the condition of the people? Was all right? Was all well in the land? No, right? Actually, if you flip back to Judges, the very last verse, Judges 21:25. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes, or everyone did whatever seemed right to him. So, And then so 1 Samuel 8, Samuel's getting old and he appoints sons as judges over Israel, but his sons didn't walk with the Lord, and so they turned to dishonest prophet, they took bribes and perverted justice. So the people saying, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to 1 Samuel 8, because this is the Israel's request for a king, or really demand for a king, we could even say that. Israel's demand for a king. I want to start there and then kind of work our way back to Hannah and Eli. 1 Samuel 8, Samuel's getting old. Okay, he appoints his sons as judges over Israel. His sons didn't walk in his ways. They turned to dishonest prophets. So the people say in chapter 8, starting in verse 4, so all the elders of Israel gathered together and went to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Therefore, appoint a king to judge us the same way that all the other nations have. When they said, give us a king to judge us, Samuel considered their demand wrong, so he prayed to the Lord. All right, so, and then Samuel responds, and he says, Samuel considered the demands wrong, so he prayed, and the Lord told him, listen to the people and everything they say to you. They have not rejected you, they have rejected me as king. They are doing the same thing to you that they have done to me, since the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day, abandoning me and worshiping other gods. Listen to them, but solemnly warn them and tell them about the customary rights of the king who will reign over them. All right, so Samuel immediately reminds us, and that's why I wanted to kind of backtrack. In the Pentateuch, in the Torah, we see God's provision for them, God's rescuing. I mean, He rescued them, He provided for them. I mean, He provided manna in the wilderness, even after they had rebelled against Him and sinned against Him. He still led them into the promised land. Even though nobody in that generation was able to go, He still graciously allowed them to go into the promised land. And so the people, though, were they didn't listen to the Lord. They rejected Him. They said that they've done this. They're doing the same thing that they did to me since the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day, abandoning me and worshiping other gods. So Israel was rejecting their God who had rescued them from slavery in Egypt and who had made a covenant with them and who had led them in the promised land. Israel instead demanded a king who would judge them, go before them, and fight their battles. But what does that sound like? Who was supposed to be their king and go before them and fight their battles? God, right? So they were rejecting the very God who had already proven Himself to be faithful to do these things in order to have a king. And the kings would actually become so terrible, and 1 Samuel 8:18 says that one day you will cry out because of the king that you've chosen for yourself, but the Lord won't answer you on that day. So, let's talk about this first. Was it wrong for Israel to ask for a king? Say yes. Okay. Right. So the asking of a king in itself, I would say is not wrong. There were some wrong reasons for it, right? And so, because actually God had already predicted that the Israelites would one day ask for a king. In Deuteronomy 17, 14 through 15, God said, when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you will say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us. Be sure to appoint over you a king the Lord your God chooses. All right? So, very important right there. But other passages also predicted that they'd one day ask for a king. Let's see. God told Jacob, a nation and a community of nations will come from you, and kings will be among your descendants. That's in Genesis 35, verse 11. There are similar passages, Genesis 36, 31, 49, 10, Numbers 24, 7 through 9, Deuteronomy 28, 36. I know I'm just rambling those off, but just so you know, there are other passages that deal with that too. But
in Joseph's blessing in Israel's blessing of the 12 tribes, he said the scepter will
right.
come from Judah. So
Yep.
he had a king planned, and he had a tribe
Right. He already even had the tribe in mind of where that king would come from, right? So God already knew that they were going to have a king. Now, so what were the problems with the way they asked? Well, first of all, we've already covered one, that they wanted to be like all the other nations. They look at all the nations around them and they say, well, why can't we have nice things too? They look, well, they have a king, they're doing pretty well, so why don't we have a king? What is another problem? Catherine, I think, mentioned, I think you at least hinted at it. Yeah, okay. Ooh. Yes, right. They were rejecting God as their leader, right? So think about it. God had always led them. Now, he led them through people like Moses and Aaron, priests, judges, through Abraham. God had used people to lead them, but ultimately it was God leading them, right? So now since Samuel was growing old, his sons didn't follow the Lord, and so they became worried. They were thinking, well, who's going to be our next leader? But they didn't wait on the Lord to provide. They didn't wait for God to appoint their leader. Now, God ultimately ended up appointing their leader, but it was, it would, in a way, I feel like, I could be off on this, it was almost like God was saying, all right, you want a king, you want a leader like the other nations? I'll give you a leader like the other nations, and he gave them Saul, who we'll find out later he started out okay, but eventually became a pretty terrible guy. So, yeah, right. Be careful what you ask for, because you might just get it. Really? What? Oh, did he? Okay, I saw that it was pretty likely that he was going to. Whew. Oh my gosh, that is a circus right now. Oh no. So they wanted to be they wanted to be like all the other nations, and that. What are some of the problems with that? Let's talk about that one. With them saying we want a king like all the other nations? Well, what's wrong with that?
All the other nations is,
Well, they've got evil kings, right?
they're evil nations,
Yeah,
immoral,
they're pagans, right?
that's right.
They're immoral people. They're pagans. They don't follow God. All right, so that's one problem. What's another problem?
Well, verses 10 through 18 are going to tell you the problem with having a king that God doesn't choose. He's going to draft people. He's going to take your property.
Yeah, he's going to tax you. He's going to do all these things, and he's going to take your property and all these things. Right.
The best about what's out there, he's going to take
Right.
himself.
Yeah. Right. And then, but also too, Israel. What from the very beginning, God was calling Israel to be different. Right. I mean, that's the part of the law was to make Israel holy, separate, right? So they were to be different. and we struggle with that today, do we not? I mean, as Christians, we don't want to look different. So sometimes we try to look like the world. We try to talk like the world and act like the world so that we're not viewed as Jesus freaks. But we're called to be different. We should be different, right? So, and then also they were God's people under God's rule. God, Brother Jim was talking about from Abraham on. I mean, like he chose them to be his people, right? They were God's chosen people under his rule, and then also that showed that they were envious. They were envious of the other nations, even though those other nations followed false gods. Now, we just talked about that. Was it a sermon? I can't even remember now. But covetousness. What's the problem with covetousness? It's showing that you don't trust that what God has given you is enough. You want something that you don't have because you feel incomplete without it. And so that. But it was a sermon, yeah, because covetousness leads to all sorts of other sins. Right? Because, for example. I mean, if I feel like my spouse isn't satisfying me the way that she should, well, then what's the problem with going out and finding that satisfaction somewhere else, right? That's what covetousness leads us to. So covetousness leads us to all sorts of sins, and so they were envious of the nations, even though they had other nations that were pagans. They didn't follow God. They were evil. So, like I said, we want to be like everybody else too. We want to look like everybody else. We want to make our appearance good. So, sometimes we'll, either compromise our morals, compromise the truth in order to fit in. But 2 Peter 2:19 warns against this. It says, "They promise them freedom, but they themselves are slaves of corruption, since people are enslaved to whatever defeats them." So this is what happens when we as Christians, like Israel, fall to the desire of being like everyone else. Right? Instead of gaining freedom, what do? We actually lose freedom. Right? We are becoming enslaved to something, and like just what we were talking about this morning. We're enslaved to Satan before we become Christians. Why in the world would we want to go back to that? We've been set free, we've been released, we've been given freedom, but sometimes we want that. We remember through rose-colored glasses. Sometimes we look on the past with rose-colored glasses. Sometimes I'll look back on periods of our life when I don't know, I can't think of a specific example, but I'll look back on a period of my life, and I'm like, oh, that was a pretty fun time, that was a pretty good time. But then I start to think about it, well, wait a minute, we went through this and this and this, and we went through some hardships during that time. But, we tend to look back on the past with rose-colored glasses. And, Israel did this when God delivered them. People complained, the people rose up against their leadership, and they wanted to even go back to slavery. But we do the same thing today. And so God decides to allow to have them a king and to pretty much choose, the way that they're to be governed. They're moving from tribes and judges to now being in a kingdom, and this is the start of the kingdom, the monarchy. So God showed great grace by allowing Israel to make mistakes and learn from their consequences. So in Judges, we're left with chaos. And 1 Samuel starts with the story of a woman named Hannah who's grieved because she can't have children. As I was reading this, I was really kind of, it pulled me into the story because it's like we're left with chaos. And then we come up to this woman named Hannah. And first of all, like we said, women in the Near Eastern culture didn't have a prominent place in society. Right, and so for the first story we read after Judges to be the story of a woman, is interesting in and of itself. But then you start to read about Hannah's faith, and it's really quite striking. So let's see. Let's read 1 Samuel, chapter 1, and we'll start in verse 1 and read through 18. All right. So there was, and I'm going to slaughter these words. There was a man from Ramathaim Zophim in the hill country of Ephraim. His name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuppah, an Ephraimite. He had two wives, the first named Hannah and the second named Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah was childless. This man would go up from his town every year to worship and sacrifice to the Lord of armies at Shiloh, where Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were the Lord's priests. Whenever Elkanah offered a sacrifice, he always gave portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and to each of her sons and daughters. But he gave a double portion to Hannah, for he loved her, even though the Lord had kept her from conceiving. Her rival would taunt her severely just to provoke her, because the Lord had kept Hannah from conceiving. Year after year, when she went up to the Lord's house, her rival taunted her in this way. Hannah would weep and would not eat. "Hannah, why are you crying?" her husband Elkanah would ask. "Why don't you eat? Why are you troubled? Am I not better to you than 10 sons?" On one occasion, Hannah got up after they ate and drank at Shiloh. The priest Eli was sitting on a chair by the doorpost of the Lord's temple. Deeply hurt, Hannah prayed to the Lord and wept with many tears. Making a vow, she pleaded, "Lord of armies, if you will take notice of your servant's affliction, remember and not forget me, and give your servant a son, and I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and his hair will never be cut. So what is she doing right here? Remember back to Samson? Yeah, no, of the vow of what? The Nazarite. Yeah, Nazarite vow, right? So she was committing to him, to the Lord. While she continued praying in the Lord's presence, Eli watched her mouth. Hannah was praying silently, and through her lips, though her lips were moving, her voice could not be heard. Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, "How long are you going to be drunk? Get rid of your wine." "No, my lord," Hannah replied. "I'm a woman with a broken heart. I haven't had any wine or beer. I'm pouring out my heart before the Lord. Don't think of me as a wicked woman. I've been praying from the depth of my anguish and resentment." Eli responded, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant your request, the request that you've made of him. May your servant find favor with you," she replied. Then Hannah went on her way, and she ate no longer and looked despondent. All right, so what strikes you the most? There's a lot in here. What strikes you the most in this story? Had life been fair to her? No, right? So she was unable to conceive. Right? Her husband has another wife who has borne sons. Now, it says that he loved her, even though she was still barren, which shows a lot about his faith and his character, right? But life hadn't been fair to her. And yeah, that's what I'm saying. Then the other woman would taunt her. It doesn't say, it just says her adversary, but I think it was probably the other wife. And remember, in ancient Israel, children were important. They were the symbols of, the family line, right? And so the family line, the inheritance would be passed on through the oldest male. In Hannah's case, though, her childlessness was a double burden, because her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. Now, it says that Elkanah took his family every year to Shiloh to worship at the tabernacle there. So we know that he was a righteous man. He had faith in God. I mean, he was doing what he was supposed to do. Hannah met with her friends and family, though she still remained childless, and so we can understand why Hannah was in pain. We can understand why Hannah was bitter, and she wouldn't eat, she wouldn't drink. Let's see, I'm going to skip over a little bit just for time.
The most striking thing to me, though, Brother John, as bad as she wanted a child, she said, "I'll give it up."
Yeah, right. And that's what I was going to say. What struck me most was her posture of humility through all of this. Lord, I want a son so bad, but I'm willing to not. Right, but if you do, I'm going to. If you give me a son, I'm going to dedicate him to you. But if you don't, I'm going to worship you anyway. Yeah, right. So, in her bitterness, though, in her sadness, she took two steps. All right, number one, she took her bitterness to God. She didn't just wallow around in self-pity. She didn't, just woe is me. She took her request to God, her bitterness to God. And second, she reordered her priorities. She said, okay, well, a son is important to me, but my faith is more important to me. She made a commitment to dedicate the son that she prayed for to God. So she didn't just want for a son for herself. She was willing to give that child up in service to the Lord. And so look at her prayer back in verse 111. It says, let's see, making a vow, she pleaded, "Lord of armies, if you will take notice of your servant's affliction, remember and forget me not, and give your servant a son, and I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and his hair will never be cut." See, she was willing to. She didn't just want a son for herself at this point. And what's interesting, too, is that Hannah is portrayed as more intimate in her relationship with the Lord than even Eli. Now, who is Eli? He was the priest, right? At first, you kind of like think, okay, Eli was, kind of knows what he's doing here, right? But then when you really start to look at it, I think her faith is stronger than his. Because in her prayer in chapter 1, Hannah used Yahweh's name 7 times, where Eli never used the name Yahweh. He simply used a less relational, more distant phrase, God of Israel, instead. The New American Commentary says this: here, as elsewhere, Eli is portrayed as a man unable to distinguish appearance from reality, as a man who himself lacked substance. Though Eli was the high priest of Shiloh and ostensibly a man of exceptional spiritual maturity, he is consistently depicted by the narrator as spiritually blind and inert. He was a man who watched lips instead of perceiving hearts, who judged profound spirituality to be profligate indulgence in spirits, who heard nothing when the Lord spoke, and who criticized his sons for abusing the sacrificial system, yet grew fat from their take. Fittingly, in the end, his powerful career was surpassed by those who were, quote-unquote, nothing, a socially powerless rural woman and a child. So Hannah is finally able to conceive in chapter 1, chapter 1, starting in verse 19, really 20. After some time, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel because she said, I requested him from the Lord. All right, and then she sings a song in chapter 2. It's interesting too. She comes up to Eli and in verse 26, she says, please, my Lord, she said, as surely as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this boy, and since the Lord gave me what I asked for, I now give the boy to the Lord. For as long as he lives, he is given to the Lord. Then he worshiped the Lord there. And then so Hannah's prayer in chapter 2, Hannah prayed, my heart rejoices in the Lord, my horn is lifted up by the Lord. My mouth boasts over my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. There is no one holy like the Lord. There is no one besides you, and there is no rock like our God. Do not boast so proudly or let arrogant words come out of your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and actions are weighed by him. The bows of the warriors are broken, but the feeble are clothed with strength. Those who are full hire themselves out for food, but those who are starving hunger no more. The woman who is childless gives birth to 7, but the woman with many sons pines away. The Lord brings death and gives life. He sends some down to Sheol, and he raises others up. The Lord brings poverty and gives wealth. He humbles and he exalts. He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the trash heap. He seats them with noblemen and gives them a throne of honor. For the foundations of the earth are the Lord's. He has set the world upon them. He guards the steps of his faithful ones, but the wicked perish in darkness. For a person does not prevail by his own strength. Those who oppose the Lord will be shattered. He will thunder in the heavens against them. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. So she first of all, what does this kind of remind you of? There's another song in the Bible by a woman. Yeah, Mary's song. After she is told that she's going to conceive, the angel appears to her, and she said, my soul magnifies the Lord. It's very similar to Mary's song, which is interesting to me, because I can't find the words to figure out to say why it's interesting to me, but they're just. Can you think? What? Parallels. Yeah, the parallels. I'm drawing a blank.
Both of them, it's a miracle birth.
Right, miracle birth.
Both of them have a child that's going to be dedicated to God.
Right.
And both of them yield. He told Mary a sword's going to pierce your heart because of your son. And with Hannah, she took the child, and it had to grieve her to give up her.
Yeah, right.
So there was a lot of parallels.
Now, and what's interesting too is the Lord actually ends up giving her other sons, but after she was willing to give up Samuel, right? So I would actually say too, in spite of, or maybe even because of her infertility, Hannah was a woman of faith. And regardless of whether it was in spite of or because of, she had deep faith in God. In fact, she is shown as being a righteous woman in the Old Testament. She's shown going up to the Lord's house. No other woman in the Old Testament is mentioned doing this. In addition, Hannah is the only woman shown making and fulfilling a vow to the Lord. She's the only woman who we have a specific prayer for in the Old Testament. Furthermore, her prayer includes, some of the she mentions the name of Yahweh more times, or 18 times. She's shown when she is barren, she goes to the Lord for help. She brings her requests to the Lord. And remember also too, one of the judges, Jephthah. Do you remember what happened with Jephthah? The vow that he made? Yeah, he ended up, the vow that he made, he actually ended up sacrificing his daughter, right, because of the vow that he made. But contrast to that, she gave her daughter up as a living sacrifice, rather than Jephthah, who actually had to end up killing his daughter. So she gave her child up, but it was in service to the Lord. So just to show the faith that she had. So let's see. Then we see that Elkanah went home to Ramah, but the boy ministered before the Lord under Eli the priest, which gives a kind of a transition between the story of Elkanah's family and the story of Eli's family. Responsibility for Samuel's upbringing, his upbringing was now transferred from Elkanah to Eli because the youth was set apart for service to the Lord. And so the Lord blesses Hannah's family, and then he judges Eli's family. And so this kind of contrasts two families here. We've got the story of Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, which that describes the evil that they did as priests. It also, though, demonstrates Samuel's faithfulness to the Lord, and the growth that he had, because like it says in, let's see, where is it? First Chronicles 6. I want to make sure that I have this right. 6:22. Well, I don't think I have this verse right, but and Samuel wore, in his service at Shiloh, Samuel wore the ephod, which was a sleeveless, hip-length garment that only members of the Levites could only wear. So, which was an indication that Samuel, even in his young age, had taken on the role of a priest, and so he was given privilege and position even in his young age, and as opposed to his son, Eli's sons, who were abusing their duties. It says that they were back. Let's see, chapter 2. This is the way they treated all the Israelites who came there to Shiloh. This is verse 15. Even before actually, let me back up to 12, really. They didn't respect the Lord, the priest, or the priest's share of the sacrifices from the people. When anyone offering a sacrifice, this is where I wanted to pick up, the priest's servants would come with a 3-pronged meat fork while the meat was boiling and plunge it into the container, kettle, cauldron, or cooking pot. All right, so they were supposed to get there. The meat was theirs to take and eat, but how were they supposed to get it? From the pot, right? After the meat was boiled, right? The priest would claim for himself whatever the meat fork brought up. This was the way they treated all the Israelites who came there to Shiloh. Even before the fat was burned, the priest's servants would come and say to the ones who were sacrificing, "Give the priest some meat to roast, because he won't accept boiled meat from you, only raw." So what are they basically trying to do? You take the sacrifice for themselves, right? So when they put the meat into the boiling pot, it was the good portion of the meat, the fatty part, was burned off, and that was kind of like the first portion or whatever of the meat to the Lord. And so and whatever was left over, they stuck their fork in and they got out, and they were able to eat that. But what they were doing was saying, give the meat to us first, so that we can take the first portion of the meat. And if that person, and to make matters worse, if that person said to them, "No, the fat must be burned first." So in other words, if a regular person came up to the priest and said, "No, that's not the way that God described, that God commanded for this to be done," then you can take, the servant would reply, "No, I insist that you hand it over right now, and if you don't, I'll take it by force." So, this is almost, just not only are they not following God's commands, which are very clear for the Levites, they're pretty much just slapping God in the face at this point, in defiance. Yeah. Right. 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 Well, and right. Right. Right.
So it says something about the sons even more, because Eli goes and says, "You don't want to do with these things."
Right.
And they didn't listen. So they're hard-hearted. Yes, the mom had to have great faith, but Eli had to be a man of God. He just didn't do what he should have killed his boy.
Yeah. Well, and that's brings me to my next point, was this, that we see from the text that, well, first of all, Eli in verse 22 of chapter 2 says Eli was very old, and he heard about everything his sons were doing to all of Israel, and how they were sleeping with the women who had served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. So they had taken this a step further, all right, and we don't know I don't know exactly what the women at the entrance of the tent of meeting were. They could be temple prostitutes. They could be ones who were involved in the temple worship. But regardless, it's wrong. Regardless of who they are, it was wrong. All right, so he said to them, "Why are you doing these things? I've heard about your evil actions from all these people. No, my sons, the news I hear the Lord's people spreading is not good." So when did Eli confront his sons? When he was very old. Do we think that his sons just started doing this when he was old? No. This had been going on for a long time. And Eli was just confronting his sons when he was old. Reading between the lines, you get the picture that he's like, Eli's starting to get, oh, okay, I'm about to die. I'm getting pretty old. I need to do something about my sons. But by this time, it was really too late. But then you contrast that to Samuel, who Eli pretty much raised. And Samuel is seen as a righteous man, growing in his faith, growing in his duty to God, and fulfilling his duties to God. And two, we see that even though Eli confronts his sons and calls his sons out, if you flip over to chapter 4, verse 18, this is when Eli dies. When he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell backward off the chair by the city gate, and since he was old and what? Heavy. He was old and heavy. His neck broke, and he died. He what? Well, I think that there's reason to believe that even though Eli confronted his sons about what they were doing in the temple, he was actually benefiting off of it. They were taking the choice part of the offering to fatten themselves, and Eli didn't reprove his sons until he was very old. So, So this really starts us off, and I love the way that 1 Samuel starts, because it doesn't just start with David or Saul, really. I mean, it doesn't just start with Saul, and it doesn't even really just start with Samuel. We see that we see this transition now from Elkanah's family to Eli, right? And then we see, and it just. So when you look at this story, I mean, you see God, I mean, all through this story, you see God's sovereignty, you see His presence, you see His promises, you see His covenants, and you see His kingdom. Because it was through that transition, I mean, this, God then, eventually carried that on to completion in.
Well, and it's interesting here, that last verse you read, verse 18, talking about Eli, it says that he judged Israel 40 years.
Yeah.
You go back to the Hebrew Bible, and you go from Judges, the last judge is Samson, and the next judge mentioned is Eli. Even though Eli was a priest, he was a judge.
He was judged before that, right.
And remember, in Judges, the judges were doing
this, right, getting worse, going downhill.
to the bottom,
Yeah,
even lower than Samson.
right. And Samson was pretty bad.
But Eli, not only did he not do what he was supposed to, but he raised up two sons who were pathetic.
Right, exactly.
And so you've reached the bottom of the barrel
Right.
when you reach
Yep.
Eli.
So next week we will pick up then with Samuel's call, and then we'll get into the rise of Saul. So thanks for coming, y'all.